and I'm going to introduce. So it's great to have Bob Lingard here today. Bob's professorial fellow in the Institute of Learning for Learning Sciences and Teacher Education at the Australian Catholic University, also emeritus professor at University of Queensland and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in both Australia and the UK. Most of you are aware of Bob's tremendous contribution to education policy field as the author and editor of numerous influential books and articles covering a wide range of topics, many focused in the areas of global governance and policy sociology. So over to you, Bob. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Pete, for those kind introductory words, and Javier, you for co-chairing. And congratulations to Network 23. I think it's great running this seminar series. My paper is entitled Multiple Temporalities in Critical Policy Sociology and Education. And this is new work for me and some things I've been thinking about for a while. So the paper is a sort of trying out, but it has just been accepted for publication in Critical Studies in Education. I sent the corrections to the galley proofs last night, and there's a forthcoming special number of that journal, guest edited by Glenn Savage, which is a sort of stock take on where some researchers, some scholars think policy sociology is at. And I think it'll be of interest to all the members of Network 23. And Stephen Ball is going to write a response to the papers. And Jenny Oscar has got an essay as well. So I haven't got a PowerPoint. I'm in Singapore, not in Australia. And so I'll speak to and sort of read my paper. The way I'm going to operate is just give a couple of introductory comments. Then I'm going to look at the question of temporalities and how they look and feel in policy and in policy sociology. But then I'll look at 4 areas where I think the temporal works in particular ways. One will be the changing historical definitions of policy. The second will be policy histories. The third will be what I'm calling the temporal construction work of policy. Just as policy constructs a problem in a particular way to which it offers a putative solution, so it situates, constructs a particular history, a past, a present, and often an imagined better future. And then finally, I'll look at the changing temporalities, the changing spatio-temporalities that policy and our analysis are located within. So to begin, more than 30 years ago, policy sociology was defined by Jenny Oscar, 1987, as, quote, rooted in the social science tradition, historically informed, and drawing on qualitative and illuminative techniques, unquote. And it's that historically informed aspect that is the concern of my presentation. And I'm extending that to all aspects of the temporal in relation to policy. And I take temporal here in a way described by MacLeod, not as a fancier word for time, but as signifying the messy and moving relations between the past, the present, and the future. And I think historiography in historical scholarship is a nice way to think about those moving relations, the rewritings of history, the rewritings of the past. Webb and colleagues in a recent paper have suggested that there are 3 modalities to temporality, what they call the chronologic, the aeonic, and the chaironic. The first, the chronologic, refers to the measurement of time and is quantitative and empirical, and references past, present, future. The second, aeonic, refers to time as duration, unbounded, as argued by the French philosopher Henri Bergson. And I think that's experienced as memory and as habits. And finally, the chaironic modality refers to impacts upon chronologics and references timeliness. So it's a particular moment that's propitious for the development of something, a particular policy conducive to that development. By and large, I would say policy and our work in policy sociology work within that chronologic modality. certainly policy is managed within such a rationalist modality. Memories and habits associated with the aeonic temporality also have effects in the production of policy texts and on their enactment, that is, on the actors. The chaironic refers to the emergence of particular conjunctures that precipitate and influence the kind of policy produced. And in my presentation, I would suggest we're looking at two significant conjunctions as part of chaironic modality of temporality. And these are the end of the Cold War and everything that flowed subsequent to that, globalization, the neoliberal, and you know all about it. And then the contemporary resurgence of nationalisms. And I think they have policy effects, but they work with different spatio-temporalities. It's interesting to me, in thinking about temporalities, what data, the rise of artificial intelligence, and so on, how they will relate to anticipatory and real-time governance. And I think there's fertile ground for future theorizing here, but the purposes of my paper are less mundane, more mundane, seeking to document the significance of temporality for analyzing education policy as a step towards developing that theorizing. So I'm arguing that temporality has largely been neglected in policy sociology. With my colleague Fazil Rizvi, when we reflected upon Oscar's definition, we suggested that policy sociology in education has purposes beyond just the descriptive and the analytical, but includes the normative and imaginative. And it's the latter, I think, which points to the temporal context and purposes of both policy and policy analysis looking to a future. So I'm working with the temporal, and my argument will be situated against the ways the temporal has been dealt with or indeed neglected in policy sociology. As such, it has implications for both theory and methodology in policy sociology. Now, I'm not going to pursue those, and I'm thinking more about that, but that's where I will get to at the end of the presentation. The next section considers temporalities in education policy, and then I go to those four foci I mentioned before. So I think policy and policy sociology overwhelmingly emphasize past, present, and future relations within a chronologic temporality. And this is the temporal context of policy and in relation to the discursive temporal work that policy does. I mean, I think despite the discursive temporal work of policy, there is an implicit assumption of continuities between past, present, and future, path dependencies. Some have argued, and recently Seller and Gulson in a Journal of Education Policy article, have argued that artificial intelligence, where algorithms learn from algorithms and perhaps suggests possible futures which are indeterminate and disjunctive with the present, but they're matters beyond what I'm looking at in this paper. I think unspoken in the Oscar definition was that policy was under the jurisdiction of the nation. Schooling's always been important to the constitution of the imagined community, which is the nation. So until the end of the Cold War and the emergence of neoliberal globalization, education policy was almost exclusively, as John Clark puts it, devised, directed, and enacted by the nation state or subnational political units within it. The end of the Cold War changed that with the creation of a global economy and flows across borders. This changed situation challenged methodological nationalism in policy sociology research and called into question, as Sasson has argued, the assumption of the nation state as a container representing a unified spatio-temporality. The globalization challenge to methodological nationalism also precipitated matters to do with new spatio-temporalities, with significant implications for policy and policy sociology. This era has ushered in what Leidy called world time, an emergent new spatio-temporality, with the end of utopian meta-narratives, the end of redemptive modernist assumptions of inevitable progress, and a chaperoning perhaps of a managerialist incrementalism in policy with somewhat limited horizons of expectation. Now, you could argue, as Chakrabarty probably would, that Leidy's concept of world time works with a modernist universalist construction and suggests it applies in the same ways to the global south and the global north. But I would argue we need to acknowledge different temporalities operating within and across nations. Globalization has powerfully affected the temporalities associated with policies in the rich nations of the world and perhaps also in others. Just as you could argue there's an alignment between the habitus of elite policymakers within nations and in international organizations, I think we could argue there's an alignment in temporalities between them as well. Regarding the new temporalities, there's many ways to think of them. Hassan speaks of digital time as opposed to analog. Spivak says that globalization is basically on our computer screens. Sasson says that globalization is really the constitution of global data infrastructures, which facilitate the fast movement of data and policy ideas around the globe. Globalization enabled by these new communication technologies has had significant temporal effects which are played out in education policy. One of the best known ways of representing this is talk of fast policy making and policy mobilities and the work of Peck and Theodore. Yet this concept of fast policy making can be overstated, I think. We see today new global policy mobilities, but as Peck and Theodore suggest, the achievement of policy outcomes on the ground remains a stubbornly localized, context-specific process. So there's mobility, fixity, global, local imbrications of contemporary education policy linked to different temporalities. A fast mobility across the globe of policy ideas and the slow or perhaps slower implementation of policy in specific places and institutions. Yet we also need to acknowledge, if taking a more global perspective, that the speeding up of time perhaps applies to the more privileged policymakers in the more privileged nations. Sharma has argued that each nation has an architecture of temporality and that those differences mediate policy processes, policy cycles. I think also we need to take a critical view of fast, slow as tropes to describe aspects of contemporary experience, including in relation to policy mobilities, policy production, and the enactment of policy. There's some work on schooling, of course, that deals with competing temporalities. Leighton Gray contrasts the asynchronous experience of school students with the internet outside school and the synchronous character of classroom encounters framed by policy. In a more extended way, Thompson and Cook see schools and teachers' work existing in two time frames, one of discipline a la Foucault and the other one of control a la Deleuze, with the digital enabling the ongoing, uninterrupted surveillance and continuous real-time measurement of teachers' and students' performance. They speak of arrhythmia to depict how teachers work between disciplinary and control temporalities and work with them simultaneously. This affects the enactment of policy and experiences of time. And I think Sharma, her work on power chronographies, where she's working off Sasson's work on power geographies, I think this notion of power chronographies grasp those two sets of temporalities that Thompson and Cook were talking about. And it's a way also thinking of power chronographies, how time is experienced differently across the policy cycle. Bowman speaks of liquid modernity, which I think resonates with Deleuze's controlled society idea. Bowman argues that in the past, the concept of the modern was searching for the final act of perfection. In contrast, he suggests that liquid modernity sees modernity reference an infinity of improvement with no final state in sight. And this is computer adaptive testing, controls society. While Peck and Theodore problematise the concept of fast policy and are concerned to interrogate the conditions that enable it, they nevertheless argue, quote, speed does indeed seem to be of the essence here, but is a kind of speed that is manifest in the intensification of long-distance interconnections, one that is revealed in the fortified reach and extended range of mobile policy frames, routines, and models, and one that takes account of the heightened immediacy, saliency, and indeed urgency of what has apparently become increasingly compressed policy-making moments. The end of the Cold War is capital framing of education in attempts to enhance the quantity and quality of a nation's human capital. And that's linked to the emergence of a global economy, world time, new temporalities. In the sociology of ed and then policy ed, policy sociology, a move to emphasize the global and global impacts upon the local. Think of all the work on the OECD for rich nations, UNESCO and the World Bank for developing nations. And we've now perhaps moved to a point in policy sociology where methodological nationalism has been replaced by methodological globalism. And I would suggest we need to move beyond that binary, particularly at this particular moment in history of the rise of new nationalisms, ethno-nationalisms, and so on. Larson and Beach argued a short while ago that too much of the research on globalization and education policy only looked top-down, the way global policy effects were mediated by national and subnational policy actions. Instead, they argued, rightly in my view, that we need to go beyond this top-down unidirectional account and instead see the multiple directionalities, bottom-up, globalization from below, and multiple cartographies of power and policy. They also acknowledge, as with others, that the nation is central to the constitution of the global and vice versa. And of course, the same applies to the subnational and emergent topological relationships. Sasson argues what we have is the localization of the local and the globalization of the local. And what we have here are varying spatio-temporalities, including world time and relational national temporalities, with varying architectures of time in different globally positioned national schooling systems. Now, space and the temporal are closely related, imbricated with each other. There's a significant temporal element to mobility. Movement and mobility are both productive of time and space, thus talk of spatio-temporalities. The talk of globalization and Harvey of time-space compression. It is probably the case, though, I would argue, that the turn to the spatial in social sciences and talk of spatio-temporalities and time-space compression have given much, much more emphasis to the spatial and have, in a way, tended to neglect, to deny the temporal. And I think we've got to give more emphasis to the temporal in that concept of the spatio-temporal. So Brennan, in a really clever book, reflecting on the spatial turn, said that we've overcome the temporal and we're now focusing from the tempo to scale, from the chronometric to the cartographic. And I think that's an overstatement, and I'd want to bring the temporal back in to the concept of the spatio-temporal. And this is where Sharma's work on power chronographies, complementing Massey on power geographies, comes in. She suggests, Sharma, that Massey regarded space as both located and interconnected and always under construction. In an homologous way, Sharma argues that time is multiple and relational, and that power geographies must be seen as interwoven with power chronographies, a way of including the temporal in the spatio-temporal. While there has been a neglect of the temporal in policy sociology, it needs to be acknowledged that there have been some macro policy histories. I think of Ken Jones's policy history of post-war schooling in the UK, Ball's work and his little book on Foucault, and a recognition that the temporal has been neglected. You know, a long time ago, Jenny Osger, in her policy book for Open University Press, made this very point. She argued for the significance of the historical context of policy, the significance of the construction of policy as progress in policy production and policy research, and the importance of life histories of policymakers, the aeonic modality for understanding policy changes. Others have utilised Foucauldian concepts, Trevor Gale, policy genealogy, policy archaeology. Ball has proffered a rewriting of the history of education policy, utilising that set of Foucauldian concepts. He argues that contingent histories, genealogies, were necessary to Foucault's rejection of essentialisms. Mansell emphasised the temporal in relation to policy narratives, changing spaces of policy making, and a conception of the future as open, thus allowing for politics. Golson likewise draws upon the work on space of Massey and suggests that the construction of policy spaces and of policy trajectories seek to constitute a particular future. MacLeod, I've mentioned her definition of the temporal, and she argues that we need to recognise and research the complex interweavings of past, present, and future. And I think that is very important. And of course, our domain of policy sociology has its own history. Now, I'm wary of being UK-centric here, but certainly Osger and Dale have documented the significance of the Thatcher government and its attacks on neo-Marxist sociology of education in university schools of education in the UK, aligned with the rise of policy as the way education systems now steer schools at a distance in the restructured state, as central, both of these, to the emergence of policy sociology. This policy turn in sociology was evident in the creation of the Journal of Education Policy in 1985 by Stephen Ball and his colleagues. Dale, Lauder, Brown, Halsey have spoken of our domain as being a redemptive project, future-oriented, seeking to create a more socially just society. And I think policy sociology has been, policy sociology research, a redemptive project. I'll now move to my four foci, and I'll try to go quickly because I have a fair bit more that I wanted to get across. So the first consideration of history and critical policy sociology focuses on how the concept of what policy is changes historically, while also acknowledging that policy is always a temporal intervention into the world. So policy, however we defined it, its definition has changed over time. And one that I've used in the past is that old definition by Easton. Policy is the authoritative allocation of values, and arguing that each element has been affected by globalization. Authority, the authority of the state within the nation, there's now global pressures, and that authority works differently in the restructured state bureaucracies through new public management and subsequently network governments. And allocation, the state structures, allocation occurs in different ways, and values, of course. There's now a global flow of policy ideas, policy mobilities. But there are other ways now, I think, to see policy. Some are seeing policy as sitting in networks stretched across the globe, and also in assemblages. Also, the moves to policy as numbers. And I think for all of us as researchers in policy sociology and education, that datification, enhanced computational capacities will have a lot of impact in our area. And it's something that we will need to keep abreast of. And its impacts on policy will be very, very interesting indeed. In Australia, there's a new research institute created by the federal government, which is going to collect data, and that's to be fed back into schools for improvements. But it's almost as if policy is being subsumed under data and doesn't have its own entity. I think I've said enough about the changing definition of policy and what this thing is that we're researching. And often, of course, as Stephen Ball argued some considerable time ago, we just, in our writing and research, take for granted what this thing is, which is the focus of our attention, the focus of our research. And I think we need to come to an understanding of what policy is. Of course, in her 2000 book, Jenny Oscar, in quite an ecumenical way, said that policy was that we could call policy anything which had policy effects. So if I come to my second focus, the history of education policy, Stephen Ball, drawing on Foucault, has suggested that a history of education policy might be thought of as a history of changing problematizations, in education. Sorry, I just lost my place here. Yeah, he suggested that a history of policy might be conceptualized as a history of problematizations of education. That is, the problems which come at a particular moment. Education as a field, according to Webb and colleagues, it's always attempting to reform or improve itself. And they say, quote, reform efforts are the habitual attempts to improve upon failed memories of a glorious future. And in a way, they argue that the future construction, the imagined better, that's a way of governing the present. But I think in this, we see the redemptive aspirations of policy. More prosaically, we might look at the history of a policy domain. So how social justice has changed from Keynesian times through globalization down to the time of new nationalisms, ethno-nationalisms, rejections of multilateralism by some nations, and so on. And we could link those changes to broader eras or epochs, or I've always really liked Raymond Williams' evocative phrase, structure of feeling, to pick up on the dominant cultural norms and practices at a given time that frame our actions, and as well as framing our actions, they also frame the way affect manifests in multiple aspects of life, including in policy production, mobility, and enactment. There is another way of thinking about the historical framing of education policy, a chaironic modality of temporality. Its acknowledgement of balance point, that public spheres always affect worlds to which people are bound when they are by affective projections of a constantly negotiated common interestedness. Education policy is part of that public sphere as an affect world, and is affected by what Ahmed called the national mood, or what Williams would call the national structure of feeling. And at this particular historical moment, there's a very significant historical framing of education policy. In our era of the Anthropocene, environmental and sustainability education policy is very important. And analyses of that, whether they challenge the dominant neoliberal or whether they go beyond this, it's clearly a pressing time for education policy, and indeed education, that acknowledges what Rapoli and Komatsu call the finiteness of global resources. It's a brilliant paper in a recent number of comparative education. With colleagues in Australia, I've chased the changing history of social justice in Australia. And in so doing, we argued that we went from the Keynesian construction, which was about redistributive funding to communities, poor communities, and the schools in those communities, to try to provide the same opportunities as more privileged young people had. There was also a debate at that time, a philosophical one, about whether we were talking about opportunity or outcomes in terms of equality. But what we've seen more recently in Australia, we had in 2010 the introduction of national testing. And what we've seen in relation to this national testing is a reconstruction of social justice. Each school's performance on a public website called My School is compared with 59 other similar schools. And in this context, social justice has been reconstituted as getting better scores on the numeracy and literacy tests than your 59 other comparative schools. It's a comparative judgment. It's not a philosophical construction. As well, social justice is deemed to be the number of students getting above the minimum score level. And I think we can see OECD and PISA working in a similar way, with equity on PISA being a measure of the strength of socioeconomic background on test scores. In this context, I think we've seen with the human capital framing, producing the appropriate quantity and quality of human capital for the national economy, that social justice has become seen to be removing barriers to equality of participation in a competitive test-driven schooling system. Equity has become almost a market-enhancing mechanism. In Australia, the equity argument is about this would be better for the Australian economy, not a philosophical argument. So we can do these historical takes on changing driving concepts or policy domains. My next section is the temporal construction work of policy. And I think similar to the way Bourdieu argued that the logics of practice of journalism in respect of news suffer from historical amnesia, that the lead story always has to be new. It doesn't have any historical lineage. There's a desire for the ever new. He also spoke of circular circulation, the way stories and news moves across locations, different media, different nations. And so it is with much education policy today. But there's something of a presentism, I think, in much contemporary policy, along with a present-future construct and a neglect of a past-present focus. Various scholars have interrogated how policy discursively constructs the problem to which its policy is proffered as a solution. McLaughlin here speaks of the problem. Backy and Webb used Foucault's construction of problematization to say that the first step in policy analysis is to look at how the text of the policy, discursively and textually, has constructed the problem. Seddon, in a similar way, and I know Terry spoke in this series last week, argued that policies construct their context. And we can look at that now, how policies almost inevitably construct a global context. But my argument here is, as well as problem and context construction, policies also construct temporalities. They usually proffer a critique of what's gone before, while at the same time working incrementally in form, language, and approach with previous policies in the domain. And this incrementalism is often hidden by the aspirational descriptions of the new policy. And of course, all politicians want to leave their mark. And so there is this idea that there's a break with the past and this is new and will lead to a better future. But that is the way the present is governed. At the same time, policies construct that imagined future, one that is constituted as a step forward beyond the present and certainly beyond past approaches. So unlike Walter Benjamin's Angel of History that turned its back to the future, policy, I think, discursively turns its back to the past and gazes hopefully to the future. Policy is about creating a better imagined future, and in discursively constructing an imagined future is, as I've said, about governing the present. We could also look at the short and long-term goals of policies. We could also look at the broader milieu and changes in it and how they're played out in policies. I've always been taken by Bourdieu's observation that the social world is accumulated history. Schooling systems, policy are accumulated history in some way. With Fazil Rizvi, we developed an approach to policy analysis, and it had questions like, why this policy now, which I think is important in putting policy in context, and how does it link to the past? Intertextuality of policy, also I think there's a temporal element. Unintended consequences, that is a temporal element of policy. So I think the temporal construction work of policy is important in the same way that the problem construction and the contextual construction, the way they are. Next, I'll look at new spatio-temporalities associated, of course, with globalization, with impact for researching and theorizing in policy sociology. And that's the focus of this section. The spatio-temporal acknowledges that we live in both time and space, and that both are interrelated and involved in the constitution of the nation and of the global. Social theorists, Sasson in particular, have argued persuasively that globalization has altered both time and space, and as such has precipitated new spatio-temporalities. Sasson suggests that a significant effect of globalization here has been the emergence of both new national and new global spatio-temporalities and the imbrications between them. She notes that these belong to both the global and the national, but only to each in part. Each in part is significant here in relation to national and global spatio-temporalities, because they significantly overlap and interact in ways that distinguish, she would argue, our contemporary moment. Now, I'm mindful of time, and there's a lot more I could say about spatio-temporalities, but you might like just to think of the OECD's PISA and recent, and it of course functions in a particular spatio-temporality, 3 years, the following year, the results released, and so on. But if we look at where it came from, it was pressure from the United States on the OECD against OECD desires in the latter part of the 1990s, and the US test, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, was the actual model for PISA. But then PISA has now helped construct the globe with a particular spatio-temporality as a commensurate space of measurement. Now, recently, there's been some stinging critiques, and I've just written a paper about this. It's in the latest World Yearbook of Education. But the director of the US Department of Education's Institute of Education Science, Mark Schneider, has been exceedingly critical of the ambitious goals of the OECD to extend their testing regimes to enhance the scope, what's measured, the scale, the number of participating measures, and the explanations, trying to link test scores to other measures. It is what the OECD in the long term is aiming towards. But Schneider has come out, and this was still in the context of the Trump presidency and his America First, his version of ethno-nationalism, Trump's anti-multilateralism. And I would argue there was a particular US spatio-temporality here. And Schneider's critiques of the expansionary testing regimes of the OECD were enabled by the Trump regime's support for ethno-nationalism and anti-multilateralism. So he critiqued Schneider, the overreach of the OECD. He was critical of the expanding number of participants, the pulling in of PISA for development with main PISA and broadening the scale. And he argued that made the test and the results less useful for the US. He thought that the SES measure, the survey, which accompanies the tests that the students do, didn't apply to many developing countries in PISA for development. He also thought that expanding test items, global competence, for example, which the US didn't participate in 2018, that there was a limited research on it. It was costing too much. And he believed that the PISA should go back to a test for the rich nations and a move to computer adaptive testing rather than every 3 years. And you can see there's a different temporality which is being argued for there. So if I could just come to a couple of quick concluding points. And as I said, you will be able to read this paper in latest articles in Critical Studies very soon. I've tried to extend Jenny Osger's notion of policy sociology in education being historically informed to broaden it to a consideration of the temporal. And with the spatial turn, I think there's been a neglect of the temporal, given the focus on the spatial and on the global in respect of policy. So my argument would be that we need to strengthen our understandings of the temporal in relation to the spatio-temporal and in respect of policy sociology and education. And I think I'd encourage you to read Sharma's work. I've only come across it quite recently. The concept of power chronographies, architectures of temporality, complementing Massey's concept of power geographies, set against ever-changing global, national, local imbrications, and within those variant architectures of temporality. Consideration now has to be given, I think, to conjoining the temporal to the spatial, and of course we've got this the methodological nationalism replaced by methodological globalism, and I think we have to move a step beyond that. And I think there are real implications for ed theory and methodology. And I think as AI, datification, machine learning have increased impact on policy production and enactment, there's another entire project there, I think, about the impact of those things on the temporal. And just as two concluding thoughts, I think Derrida's concept of hauntology, about how ghosts of the past inflect contemporary policy developments, might be a useful way to look at a history of policy. While Durkheim's observation some considerable time ago now, that the unconscious is the forgetting of history, might also inform work on the impact of the past on policymakers and policy work. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take comments, questions, and criticisms. So thank you.
Many thanks, Bob. Thanks for such a wonderful, hugely interesting and very wide-ranging presentation. Can I invite people to pop their cameras on, and so we can see the audience? If you move into gallery view, you'll be able to see everyone. And we can open things up. I just wonder if, while you're thinking of questions, and perhaps if you want to either indicate via the chat room or wave at the screen if you'd like to talk. But Bob, what do you think about the way in which the current, the way in which crises are interrupters of the temporal? And in particular, what about the peculiar or particular moment that we have at the moment where the crisis is a global crisis? And can you just ask for some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, I think. And the strange thing is this, isn't it, about COVID-19 and the global crisis and the pandemic? I mean, the solutions have to be global. And in Australia, where the borders have been closed for a considerable time and will be, the government just have extended that. But there has been a playing into some of the nationalism, I think, at the same time as I think it's the mobilities associated with globalization which have allowed the pandemic, the movements of people, and perhaps the more privileged people who move and the less privileged don't. And the less privileged, of course, if you look at the US, has greatest impact on the African American community. So there's this global phenomenon, but I think it also has precipitated a strengthening sort of vaccine nationalism. And I think we really have to go beyond that. So I think it is a really interesting moment, and that's one way of putting it. But I think if we just come to education, one of the things that strikes me about it, and Ben Williamson and Anna Hogan have written recently about this, is the way this moment of schools being closed across the globe, the way the ed tech companies have come in, and how that works in a spatio-temporal way, and particularly when they're international, global firms, and what is being provided in schooling. I think there are interesting questions there, and Governor Cuomo, as you all would know, in New York State, has appointed Bill Gates and the former CEO of Google. Cuomo said, well, we didn't have schools across this period of the pandemic. Our schools are the future schools without walls and driven technologically. So I think it is a really interesting and strange moment, Pete, and there's so much to think about. I mean, I get the sense that every paper written in the social sciences from now on will make some mention of the pandemic and how it plays against some of these things. But in a way, the pandemic's also strengthened borders, which were being strengthened by the rise of new nationalisms. I mean, Brexit, USA is a good case in point, but there's many, many, many others, I think. So no answer to your question, Pete, but it's a really, really interesting question, and that we could spend a long time thinking about, I think.
Okay, thanks, Bob.
There is another question in the chat, and since it's the only one, I would just invite Warren to voice it rather than me rephrasing the question. So the floor is yours.
Hi there. Yeah, it's Simon Warren from Roskilde University in Denmark. I'm just moving myself to another room. And hi there, Bob. And
hi.
Yeah, I mean, this turn to the historical in broad terms, I think, is very, very welcome. I suppose my cheeky question is this a kind of re-engagement with political economy and historical political economy in particular, but without naming it as such? Yeah. But related to this is that I'm particularly interested in this kind of historical kind of approach to policy sociology. Is that the ideas that can animate and the policy formation and enactments also have their own histories and geographies. In particular, at the moment, I'm looking at how neoliberalism is depicted within, let's call it policy sociology, as if it is some kind of coherent whole, a solid object that has a history that dates from the late 1970s, when in fact, as a set of intellectual thoughts and formulations and mobilizations, it has its own histories, centered in the seismic crisis of the First World War and what followed in Europe, and then another formulation of it in America around the Chicago School, and yet we miss this, and then of course a set of ideas it articulates again within the messy processes of nation making, and the particular histories that are in there. And I'm just wondering what your reflections are on that.
Yeah, look, it's a great observation, and thank you for it. I mean, I think at one level it probably is an historical political economy, and how that's going and how that's working at the moment. And I take your point very closely that I think in a way the use of neoliberalism became quite useless when it was used to refer to everything. And of course, neoliberalism in Denmark's different from neoliberalism in England, and different from that in the US, and then if we get to other countries. Also, your point about the ideas that animate policy have histories, I think is a really, really important one. And I think, most policy sociologists are committed, I suppose, to a more socially just schooling system driven by particular sorts of policies. And philosophical thought about that changes, and has to change, of course, as Nancy Fraser's written about the impact of the global on how she thinks about social justice more broadly. So I think, and then policy works that in a different way. So there's the ideas and the history, but how they're played out, and how the playing out of the history of an institution where policy is enacted has an impact. So I'm all for bringing the history back, political economy as well. I think the way the nation fits and the way this COVID pandemic has worked in relation to the nation, and indeed to neoliberalism. But we've got a very conservative government in Australia, which has now got the largest deficit any Australian government's ever had, in terms of payments to people who lost their jobs through COVID. So I just take your broad point. I think the return of history is very important. The return of a political economy of policy, I think, likewise. I think your point of the ideas animating policy having histories, I really like that. And then the geographies of them. I'm Australian. I was born in Australia. I worked for some years in an English university, then in a Scottish one. And even though that nation colonized Australia and we speak the same language, I realized in a way that we didn't. So I think specificities are also important. And I think in terms of the global and policy, I think there's discourses around which there's some convergence, but the way they play out when they hit the nation, the subnational, then indeed the way they play out, say, in schools, there's heavy mediations across those processes. But in relation to all of those things, I think the enhanced computational capacities, the growth of data sets, datafication, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all of that sets of things, how that will play in our domain, are also very worthy of deep thought. And I think there will be huge impacts on policy from those things. And that's a different historical moment. So I don't know that I've answered your question, but I really enjoyed your observations and agree with them.
If you'd like to speak, just wave at the camera or indicate. I'm sure we have plenty. We've got a very distinguished audience here, so I'm sure there's plenty.
Yeah, I could see
people who'd like to join in. There is another question actually in the chat box from Annika.
No more, but I can ask a question.
Yeah.
Since there are no more.
Yeah, Javier. Yes.
Well, between a question and a comment, I am curious about the relationship between temporalities and regionalisms. I mean, regionalism in the sense of international relations.
Yeah.
Currently, we have a kind of global plan, which is the SDGs.
Yeah.
Substituted the MDGs, which actually sets a time frame. In Europe, we have our time frames.
Yeah.
This year, I am particularly shocked about the time frame in Latin America. When I researched Latin American policies about 10 years ago, 2021 was supposed to be the time frame. Then it lost importance, and now it seems to be completely pointless. I wonder how we can link temporalities with this kind of regionalisms, which it might be also another strand of research.
Yeah, no, I think it absolutely is. And Sharma uses the phrase architectures of temporality. And Sasson as well argues that nations have never been fully unified in terms of spatio-temporalities. And I think the regionalisms that you're mentioning, say, in Spain, but similarly in the Australian context, the states which say control schooling function in different sort of time frames. And I always thought, if you think even just of a simple example of the principal in her office in a school and the time frame she's sitting for the school to achieve certain things, and the teacher in front of the class, they're positioned in very different temporalities, and there's different power relations. And that's what Sharma wants to add to these temporalities, the sort of power. And I think, there's a lot of talk, isn't there, at the present day of speeding up, acceleration, and so on. But I think that's probably an experience of some, but not of all. I think it's class, race, gendered, and so on. So I think your points are really well taken, Javier, that there are different temporalities. And despite the attempts to sort of unify, on the ground, they play in particular sorts of ways. So I think it's a very fertile area for research, in my view.
Thanks, Bob. Annika, would you want to voice your question rather than me reading it out?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very inspirational. This is Annika from Gothenburg, Sweden.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Annika.
Hi.
Yep.
So I was thinking about how can we do more like time-sensitive policy analysis if you think about methodology. Is it to go beyond like selecting policy documents, phenomena to study like from a wider time period, wider space, like including data algorithms, or how do we do this? Like you mentioned imagination, maybe speculation even. Is it about like alternative critical temporalities? How do we do this? I just want to see like where could this?
No, I think it's a really nice question, and like let me give an example from Australia. Some number of years ago now, all the state systems and the Federal Minister for Education agreed on this set of goals for Australian schools. And they are, as you might imagine they would be, but they have a context, and that's now gone through a number of iterations. And there's a most recent one, which was formulated in Alice Springs, large Indigenous population. And I think, historically what you could do is a sort of discourse analysis and looking at the changes across those sort of policy documents. And Jenny Osger some time ago suggested that she thought that something of the life histories of policymakers and what they bring to bear would be a useful element in bringing the temporal in. But I take your point. I mean, I began by saying, and I ended by saying that what I'm arguing has methodological and theoretical implications, but it's why my conclusion is 2 short paragraphs, because I think, your question is where we need to go with this set of items. The other thing, though, some years ago, I did a piece of research in Australia, which was really looking at the changing relations between the national government in schooling policy and the state and territory governments. And constitutionally, the state and territory governments are constitutionally responsible for schooling. But we've increasingly, since the 1970s, had national involvement and national policies. And I was interested in how we went. In Australian schooling, up until the 1970s, we had no national policies. Then all of a sudden, we've had them, and they've worked through to the present. And when I did that study, Anika, I had the privilege of actually locating education ministers and directors general of education historically from the 1970s through to the present. And that was astonishing, and in particular because the retired politicians and the retired education leaders gave you a lot more than often when you're interviewing people who are currently in those positions. So I just think we lose so much. I'm often taken by some of my students, really great students, who use an idea which I know comes from 50 years ago, but they quote someone from last, you know, I think where we are and where we're going is something of the past, and how we research it in policy. I think we could take historical policy documents, we could interview people across time, we could do life histories of people. Yeah, but I'm sure you can think of some other things that we might do. Yeah. But I think it's important to do, yeah. And not just have policy analysis a static thing about this document here. Even though, of course, when we do research and do our writing, we sort of freeze time, don't we? You know, we write in the present in a way. I think time and writing, I've always thought about this in relation to PhD theses. You know, how in your writing you construct time is interesting, I think. You know, I always say to my students, you know, write your conclusion, then write the introduction, as if you were always going to get to that conclusion. And I don't know. So there's time in all of the research we do in particular ways. I think reflecting on it is a very useful thing. So I hope I've given some suggestions. You can probably think of a lot more.
Miriam, do you want to come in with your question?
Yes, sure. Hi, Bob. And thank you for a very, very interesting and inspiring speech. I'm really going to read your paper thoroughly.
Yeah.
But I think what the discussions that we're having right now about the methodological approaches to how to study temporalities, you emphasize historical approaches a lot and the history of policies and so on. And I'm just wondering if we don't actually need to move beyond historical approaches. That's certainly one of the approaches, but yeah, the historical approach, as I think it right now, might find the chronological temporalities in policy studies. And to get to the other types of temporalities, we might need some very different kind of approaches. And I think that's very interesting and a fruitful discussion to have.
I think you're right, and that's why I was using the temporal rather than the historical to argue, as Julie MacLeod has done, that there are messy and two-way relationships, you know, between the past, the present, and the future, and how we get beyond a construction of history, which is just, you know, chronological, the past to the present to the future. I think is an interesting one, and I think we could look at policy documents to see how they construct a past and how they construct a future. And perhaps you could do that with documents across a time period. But I take your point. I am not emphasizing the temporal to suggest we do and only do histories of policy. I'm just saying I think that's an element that has been neglected, and I'd want to move beyond just a past, present, future. You know, that chronologic modality of temporality, which I think is the temporality in which policy is constructed, but it probably works in other ways than that. And it's the temporality in which we've done our research on policy. So I think yeah, we need to think of ways which allow us to think backwards and forwards between past, present, and future, and how they're constructed in policy. So it's not just a backward looking, a back to the future. I think it's because policy, I think, has tended to have a back to the past, discursively, if perhaps not in reality. But I think your question, just like the other one about methodology, I mean, I think it opens up a lot of avenues, a lot of food for thought. And it was what I was trying to provoke in writing the paper. And I thought this paper's been with the journal for about a year, and I've had brilliant reviews, but they kept asking for more and kept me thinking about things. And almost in the end, the paper became different from where it was in the start, but better for it. But it then led me to think, what are the implications methodologically and theoretically? And I haven't really gone into that. And I think that's something that we should think about as well. But thanks, great question.
Conor Galvin also made a comment on the time horizons of bureaucrats. I think that since we have a few minutes left, you can also voice your comment or your question if you want.
Thanks very much, folks, and it's been a wonderful talk. This is Conor Galvin here, University College Dublin.
Yeah, hi, Conor.
Yeah, I'm absolutely fascinated by what you were saying there in relation to this connection between regionality and temporalities and so on. And it just occurred to me that we're seeing it's not a level change, but we're seeing pretty radical changes in the way that policymakers at regional levels now seem to be, to my reading at least, becoming much more proactive in relation to setting policy agendas than they were in the past. So I'm thinking of things like the emergence of the European education area, the European research area, and so on, and the role that policymakers in the Commission particularly, and the methodologies they actually use to generate those policy directions. Those sorts of things I'm finding absolutely intriguing in the last couple of years. And I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I find them absolutely intriguing as well. I mean, I was involved in a European funded project some considerable numbers of years ago now. And what struck me when we had all the nations participating and reporting on, we were looking explicitly at inclusive education. But what really struck me about the European Commission in relation to these member nations was how there was a construction of Europe going on within these policy frames. And I think statistics, I always remember in that project, the Portuguese researchers used a phrase which I think isn't very well translated into English, but it was something like a magistrature of influence. And they argued that their whole ministries of education were changing their data collection and the categories around which they collected it to align with European ones. And it seemed to us that was happening across, and it was a way in which, just as if you look at the history of statistics in France or England or the USA, having those nations, constructing them as commensurate spaces of measurement was one, I mean, in addition to Benedict Anderson's universal literacy being central to the construction of the imagined community, I think that mathematical, creating the space as a commensurate space of measurement, and that sort of happened, of course, to a lesser degree globally with the work of IEA and OECD. But I think, I've always really liked Martin Lawn and Soteria Greck's work on that. There's that book of theirs, I think, which deals with the things that you're raising. And I think now with the EU, despite the claim of education under subsidiarity being a national thing, I think there's a similar phenomenon going on in Australia where constitutionally the states control schools, but we've had for 30 or 40 years now, and we now have a national curriculum. We now have national testing. We now have national goals. And I think then Ash Amin talks about the new spatialities, and I would argue temporalities associated with globalization. And I think, the reconstitution of the nation and regions and so on, I think they're responses to the global in a way, and policy, and certainly policy as numbers, play a really large role in them, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. And
thanks, Colin.
The term policy science is also making a huge sort of comeback in recent times across Europe, particularly. And you have the emergence of groups like the JRC, the Joint Research Centre, and so on, that are not terribly widely known or terribly widely studied just yet, but are profoundly important in terms of setting policy directions. So I thought that was an absolutely intriguing point you made, and thank you for a wonderful talk generally.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Yeah, and I think your point there is a really interesting one, because I would argue that think tanks, and with network governance, philanthropies and edgy businesses are all involved in the production of the policy text. You know what I mean? And I think the pandemic has opened up more space for them and for that.
Many thanks to everyone who's asked questions. I think on that note, we're going to have to wrap up, I'm afraid, although I'm sure we'd all like to carry on for longer. That was great. Thanks, Bob. Really interesting, very, very informative, and hugely provocative as well. Lots of ideas that we can draw on and develop. Really look forward to reading the paper as well. So many, many thanks.
No, thank you. And look, it's been a privilege to be invited to do this and to talk to people. And I hope people will read my paper and write criticisms of it. I'd love that. and say what the methodological implications are, Annika, and I forget the other person who raised that issue. I think important issues.
Yeah. Well, we certainly, one of the things we are looking to do here is develop a policy research agenda. And certainly we'll be looking forward as a network to developments in that area as well, future conferences, and maybe even a future seminar series as well.
That'd be great.
So
thanks very much, Pete.
Great.
Thank you. And thanks, Javier. And thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.